Imagine this. You're sitting at a family dinner. Someone makes a cruel remark about your job, your weight, your choices. You freeze. You smile politely. You say nothing. And later that night, you lie awake replaying the scene over and over again. You come up with all the things you should have said, but it's too late. You stayed silent. Again. Not because you didn't feel the fire, but because you were afraid of the explosion. Afraid of being too much. Afraid of shaking the peace. But what if I told you that very silence is slowly killing something inside you? That every time you swallow the scream, you bury a part of your soul. Carl Jung saw this pattern with terrifying clarity. The refusal to confront conflict isn't peace, it's self-erasure, and the price is your wholeness. From the outside, you might look composed, graceful, mature, but on the inside, a war is being waged, a battle between who you are and who you pretend to be. Jung called this the split between the persona and the shadow. The persona is the mask you wear, agreeable, likable, calm. It's the version of you that avoids making others uncomfortable. It's the one who says it's fine when it's not. It doesn't matter when it does. I'm okay when you're not even close. But buried beneath that carefully rehearsed mask is the shadow, the anger. You're not allowed to express the truth. You're scared to speak the power you keep chained for fear it might make you unlovable. And the more you deny the shadow, the more it turns against you. This is the secret. No one wants to admit your fear of conflict is not a virtue. It's not wisdom. It's not strength. It's a defense mechanism, a wound masquerading as maturity. Jung understood that people will go to extraordinary lengths to protect the false peace of their lives, even if it means betraying their truth. But what is the cost of that betrayal? The soul doesn't vanish quietly. It retaliates. And it does so through resentment, through anxiety, through a quiet gnawing sense that you are not living the life you were meant to live. Every time you avoid confrontation, you are reinforcing the idea that your needs don't matter, that your boundaries aren't real, that your voice isn't worth hearing, and so you shrink, you perform, you become a master of harmony while your inner world withers into numbness. Jung warned us that the unconscious doesn't remain buried, it finds a way to surface. And when conflict is not expressed outwardly, it festers inwardly. It manifests in passive aggressiveness, depression, self-sabotage, or worse, it explodes without warning in moments when the shadow finally takes the stage. But here's the truth. Most of us are too afraid to accept conflict is not the enemy. Denial is. True growth, individuation, as Jung calls it, requires confrontation, not just with others, but with yourself. It means looking the shadow in the eye and saying, I see you. I won't silence you anymore. It means allowing discomfort to be your teacher. It means saying the difficult thing even if your voice shakes, because that trembling voice may be the first honest sound you've made in years. The world teaches us to fear conflict as a threat to connection. But Carl Jung saw something else, that conflict is the crucible where authenticity is born. When you stop hiding from it, you start discovering who you really are. And maybe that's the scariest part of all, not the fight itself, but what it might reveal. So ask yourself, what parts of you have you silenced to keep the peace? Whose approval are you still afraid to lose? And most importantly, what would your life look like if you chose truth over comfort? This is not about becoming confrontational. It's about becoming whole. To become whole is not to be liked by everyone. It is to be known by yourself. And that knowing often begins in the fire of confrontation, not in violence, not in aggression, but in courageous presence. You see, most people believe that standing up for themselves requires shouting domination or drama. But Jung would say that true confrontation isn't loud, it's lucid. It doesn't demand chaos, it demands clarity. The clarity to say, "This matters to me." The courage to say, "This boundary will be honored." The strength to say no without flinching and yes only, when your soul agrees. Yet for most of us, that kind of clarity feels terrifying. Why? Because we were not taught to trust our inner authority. From childhood, we learn to outsource our truth. We learn to defer to parents, teachers, systems, culture. We learned that love was conditional and that safety came not from being ourselves, but from adapting, pleasing, performing. That adaptation became our armor. But in protecting ourselves from rejection, we unknowingly rejected our true self. Jung called this internal fracture the root of neurosis, when the life we live no longer aligns with the life we long for. And nowhere does this fracture reveal itself more clearly than in our relationship with conflict. Because conflict is where truth meets friction. It's the threshold where your integrity is tested. It's where you either honor your wholeness or abandon it for approval. But here's the paradox. The more you avoid conflict to keep the peace, the less peace you actually have. You don't escape the tension, you internalize it. You don't avoid the damage, you just direct it inward. The smile remains, but the soul recoils. And eventually that soul begins to leak out in symptoms, anxiety, fatigue, resentment, burnout. You become a ghost in your own life. And this is where the shadow does its most dangerous work. Because when we refuse to confront the shadow, learns to protect us, but at a cost. It becomes sharper, darker, more deceptive. It learns how to manipulate, to numb, to sabotage. You begin to justify your silence as kindness. You label your passivity as spirituality. You even take pride in how much you can endure, as if endurance alone were a sign of virtue. But what if it's not? What if it's a sign of fear in disguise? Carl Jung said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." And conflict, dear listener, is one of the soul's sharpest mirrors. In every confrontation, you are faced with yourself, not just the version you want to be, but the parts you've disowned, your anger, your ambition, your desire to be seen and heard without apology. To avoid conflict is to avoid this mirror. But to enter it, to stand firm, to speak truth, to risk being misunderstood, is to begin the sacred work of integration. Integration is not perfection. It is not about always getting it right. It is about allowing all of you to exist, the soft and the strong, the peace seeker and the boundary setter, the part of you that loves harmony and the part that longs to roar. True individuation, Jung taught, is a lifelong process of becoming conscious of who you are beyond the roles you play. It is the process of recovering your voice, not to dominate others, but to no longer disappear in their presence. So what does this look like in real life? It starts small, saying no to things that drain you, saying yes to your intuition even when no one else understands it, refusing to explain yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you, choosing to be uncomfortable for a moment rather than resentful for a lifetime, choosing to risk rejection over risking your integrity. These are not grand gestures. They are subtle, sacred revolutions. And every time you take one of these steps, every time you confront instead of comply, you reclaim a piece of yourself. You remember that you are not here to be agreeable. You are here to be whole. So the next time your throat tightens and your truth begs to rise, listen. That is not weakness. That is not immaturity. That is your soul remembering its voice. And it's asking you, will you keep betraying me in the name of peace? Or will you finally let me speak? Letting your soul speak is not about becoming reactive. It is not about winning the argument. It is about something much more radical, showing up without abandoning yourself. Because the person you become when you suppress conflict isn't peaceful. That person is fragmented, stretched thin between your truth and your performance. And the longer you maintain that divide, the more exhausted you become. Exhausted from pretending. Exhausted from pleasing. Exhausted from making everyone else comfortable, while your own heart quietly bleeds beneath the surface. And so your life becomes a series of quiet betrayals. You say yes when you mean no. You laugh when you want to cry. You apologize for things that were never your fault. You rehearse entire conversations in your head, but when the moment comes, you go silent. You fear confrontation, not because it's dangerous, but because it threatens the identity you've built on silence. An identity that says, if I don't disturb the waters, I'll stay afloat. But Carl Jung would challenge that logic. He would say, if you never disturb the waters, you'll never learn to swim. Confrontation is not a storm to be feared. It is the ocean where your real self is waiting. And no one, no matter how kind or careful, can give you the life you want if you are unwilling to step into that water. You must be willing to rattle the illusion of harmony. You must be willing to risk the awkwardness, the tension, the misunderstanding, because underneath that discomfort lies your liberation. Jung saw the avoidance of conflict as a form of psychic stagnation, a refusal to grow, because growth demands friction. It demands thresholds. It demands endings. And often it demands that we say something we've been terrified to say our entire lives. This is not okay. I want something different. I'm not who you think I am. These are not easy words, but they are sacred ones. They are the language of self-respect. And here's the irony. The people who fear conflict the most are often the ones who feel most misunderstood. But how can the world understand you if you've never fully introduced yourself? How can you be loved for who you are if you're hiding behind who you think they want? Conflict is not the enemy of love. It is its initiation. Jung believed that true relationship begins where illusion ends. That real intimacy is only possible when masks fall and shadows meet in the open. Not to fight, but to recognize, to accept, to integrate, to say, this is me, and I see you too. And that requires honesty. It requires boundaries. It requires the willingness to disappoint people in order to stay loyal to yourself. This doesn't mean you abandon compassion. It means you stop confusing compassion with self-erasure, because there's a difference between kindness and submission. There's a difference between peace and paralysis. Somewhere along the way, you learned that conflict equals danger. Maybe it was the yelling in your childhood home. Maybe it was the silence after your parents' divorce. Maybe it was the rejection that followed the first time you spoke up. So you adapted. You made yourself small. You learned to tiptoe around tension. But now you're an adult, and those strategies are suffocating you. Jung would say it is time to awaken. Time to reclaim the voice you buried in order to survive. This is the part of the journey where everything feels vulnerable. You speak your truth and your hands shake. You set a boundary and your stomach flips. You feel guilt, fear, even grief. That's normal. That's healing. That's the ego releasing its grip and the self beginning to rise. Jung believed that the self, the totality of who we are, emerges only when we have the courage to face every part of our being, even the parts that others reject, even the parts we were told to hide. So if you find yourself at the edge of a difficult conversation, don't turn away. That moment is sacred. That tension is not a problem to solve, it's a path to walk. And on the other side of it is something far greater than comfort. It's freedom. Freedom is not found in being accepted by everyone. Freedom is found in being accepted by yourself, even when that self is inconvenient, messy, contradictory, or hard to explain. Carl Jung called this path individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you truly are, not who the world told you to be, not who your partner expects, not even who your ego insists you must remain, but who your soul longs to become when all masks fall away. It's a path filled with paradox, where losing approval gives you power, where surrender becomes strength, where conflict, when faced with integrity, becomes communion. You see, conflict doesn't always destroy relationships, it destroys illusions. It burns away the roles we play, the assumptions we carry, the silent contracts we never agreed to. And when the smoke clears, sometimes what's left is a deeper truth. Sometimes what's left is a relationship reborn in authenticity. But other times what's left is space, grief, solitude. And that's okay too, because the purpose of confrontation is not to control outcomes. It's to live aligned. It's to know that you stood in your truth, even if your voice trembled, even if the other person walked away. And when you do this, when you live in truth instead of tension, you begin to feel peace, not as a performance, but as a presence. A presence that lives in your body, not just your smile. A presence that says, I am no longer at war with myself. This is the peace Jung was pointing toward, not comfort, but congruence. Not avoidance, but awareness. Not harmony at all costs, but wholeness at any cost. And yes, it costs. It costs illusions. It costs the approval of people who only love the version of you that stayed silent. It costs comfort. But what you gain in return is something holy, your voice, your sovereignty, your soul. So here at the end of this journey, I ask you, what would change if you stopped avoiding confrontation and started honoring your truth? What would shift if you stopped seeking to be understood and began seeking to understand yourself? What kind of life could you live if you trusted that your wholeness is more valuable than your likability? That is the invitation. That is the inner revolution. And it begins not with noise, but with one brave word enough.